The year was 1914. Europe stood on the precipice of war, its great powers bracing themselves for a conflict that would reshape the world for generations. The streets of Paris hummed with the bustle of an empire in its prime, an empire that, unbeknownst to most, was about to be plunged into one of the most brutal and tragic wars in history. Amid the political machinations and military maneuvers, a woman, bound by the expectations of her class and her time, would quietly navigate the storm of historical forces that shaped the life of her husband, a man destined to be one of the most prominent military leaders of France during World War I. Marie d'Espéry was not just the wife of the legendary French General Louis Franchet d'Espéry. She was a woman of great resilience, intelligence, and grace who quietly influenced the course of the lives around her. Though history often focuses on the generals and the soldiers, the stories of the wives who stood beside them, often in the shadows of the battlefield, deserve to be told. Marie's story, intertwined with the fate of her husband and the tumultuous events of the early 20th century, offers a unique perspective on the trials and tribulations of those who lived through the war from a different vantage point. This is her story. The year was 1856, and the world was on the cusp of change. In the rolling hills of southern France, a child was born into a family whose name would one day echo in the hallowed halls of history. Marie d'Espéry, born Marie Leclerc, had no way of knowing that her life would become intertwined with the fates of nations, that she would become the wife of one of France's most renowned generals and a key figure in the complex interplay of military strategy and diplomacy during the turbulent years of the Great War. As a young girl, Marie was brought up in an atmosphere thick with the scent of history. The family home, nestled among vineyards in the picturesque town of Nîmes, was a place where the past was never far from the present. Conversations around the dinner table often revolved around the great wars of the past, from Napoleon's campaigns to the broader sweep of European geopolitics. Her father, a man of modest means but great ambition, often told her stories of the military men who had shaped France's destiny. Little did he know that his daughter, with her sharp intellect and unwavering resolve, would soon join the ranks of those very figures he spoke of with such reverence. Marie was a striking figure, even as a child, tall for her age, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb the world around her. She was fiercely independent, but more than her beauty or intellect, it was her quiet determination that set her apart. From an early age, she understood the delicate balance between tradition and progress, the role of women in a society on the brink of the modern age. She was well aware that her life would likely follow the path of many women before her, one of dutiful support to a powerful man. But as she grew older, she began to question this prescribed role. She could never have guessed how her path would unfold. In 1879, when Marie was in her early 20s, her life took a turn that would forever alter the course of history. She met Louis Franchet d'Espéry, a charismatic and ambitious young officer in the French army. He had recently returned from the Franco-Prussian War, a defeat that had cast a long shadow over the French national consciousness. Louis, with his tall frame and confident demeanor, seemed to embody the resilience and determination that France needed in its moment of recovery. He had risen quickly through the ranks, and though he was still relatively unknown, his reputation as a strategic mind was already beginning to take hold. Their meeting, arranged by mutual acquaintances, was nothing short of serendipitous. At a ball in Paris, surrounded by the glittering elite of the French military and political circles, Marie and Louis found themselves drawn to one another. There was an immediate connection, a shared understanding that went beyond the superficialities of aristocratic society. Louis, though often guarded, found in Marie a woman who not only understood the complexities of the world around them, but also challenged him to think more deeply about his own place within it. Their courtship, however, was not without its challenges. Marie's family, though supportive of her education and independence, had reservations about Louis. His rise in the military, though impressive, was still a work in progress. The d'Espéry name, though noble, lacked the weight of older, more established families in French society. But Marie, confident in her own judgment, was undeterred. She saw in Louis not only a man of ambition and intellect, but also one who shared her desire to shape history. The wedding, held in 1881, was a modest affair compared to the grand celebrations of other aristocratic unions. Yet it was one marked by a quiet determination, a union of two forces destined to meet at the crossroads of history. Marie, now the wife of Louis Franchet d'Espéry, began to immerse herself in the intricate world of military life. Though the role of women in this sphere was traditionally secondary, Marie quickly proved herself as more than just a passive observer. She was no mere consort. She was a partner, confidant, and soon, a force in her own right. As Louis's career progressed, so too did Marie's involvement in the complex world of French military politics. She accompanied her husband to various posts around Europe, always adapting to new environments and offering him her sharp counsel. It was during these years that she learned the nuances of power, both the visible and invisible kinds, and began to understand the shifting tides of European diplomacy. By the time World War I broke out in 1914, Louis had become a respected general, a leader of men, and an important figure in France's military establishment. Marie, having lived through the rise of her husband's career, found herself at the heart of a new kind of war. This was not just a battle of armies. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, and Marie knew that the war would change everything. The marriage of Louis and Marie, while initially forged in the crucible of personal ambition, had evolved into something far greater. They had become not just partners in love, but in the pursuit of a shared destiny. Louis's brilliance as a military strategist was complemented by Marie's insight into the broader political landscape of Europe. Together, they formed a formidable team, their fates intertwined as the world hurtled toward a conflict that would reshape the map of Europe. But as the war raged on, Marie began to see the toll it took not just on her husband, but on herself as well. The personal cost of war is often invisible, yet it is profound. For a woman of her stature, the challenges of balancing family, duty, and personal conviction were growing heavier by the day. But Marie, ever resilient, would not be deterred. As the war escalated, she found herself more deeply involved in the efforts to aid the wounded, to bolster the morale of the troops, and to support her husband's efforts on the battlefield. The Great War, as it would come to be known, was a test of strength not only of armies, but of the individuals behind the armies. Marie d'Espéry, though largely forgotten by history, played a quiet but vital role in that struggle. She was more than just the wife of a general. She was a woman who, in her own way, helped steer the course of history. As Marie Leclerc grew into adolescence, her beauty and intelligence became impossible to ignore. She was a woman of the French countryside, but her heart and mind reached far beyond the confines of her family's estate. By the time she turned 16, it was clear that Marie had inherited the quiet yet unyielding determination of her forefathers, a determination that would guide her into a world much larger than the vineyards and cobblestone streets of Nîmes. Her family, though noble, was not rich by the standards of the great houses of France. Still, Marie's father had always been a man of vision. He saw in his daughter the promise of a future far beyond provincial life. He sent her to Paris for an education, to the City of Light, where art, politics, and culture flowed like rivers. In Paris, Marie's beauty caught the eye of many suitors, but it was her sharp mind that truly set her apart. At the salons of the city's intellectuals, she captivated thinkers and artists alike with her insightful conversations and composed demeanor. It was during one of these gatherings that she first encountered Louis Franchet d'Espéry, a young officer in the French military, whose future would be entwined with her own in ways neither of them could have predicted. D'Espéry was already making a name for himself in the army, a man with a magnetic presence, known for his rigorous discipline and tactical brilliance. He was years older than Marie, but there was an undeniable connection between them from the moment they met. To Marie, He embodied the ideals of honor, courage, and duty, qualities she had grown up hearing about but had never encountered in such a vivid, living form. Louis, for his part, was struck by Marie's intellect, something rare among the women of his time. She was not content with simply being a figure of beauty and grace. She asked questions, challenged ideas, and demanded answers. He admired her for it, and in their conversations, he saw the kind of woman who could not only understand the sacrifices required by a life in the military, but who would stand beside him through the most difficult moments of his career. Their courtship, though brief, was intense and passionate. Louis, who had already seen much of the world, from the battlefields of Algeria to the rising tensions in Europe, could not help but feel that Marie was the one person who understood the weight of the world he carried on his shoulders. To Marie, Louis represented a life of purpose and service, a man whose decisions could alter the course of history. She had never been one to shy away from grand ideas or ambitious futures, and Louis, in his quiet confidence, embodied everything she had ever hoped for in a partner. They married in the spring of 1877, in a modest ceremony that nonetheless radiated the promise of something much greater. At the time, neither of them could know that their union would not only shape their own futures but also the future of a nation. Marie quickly adapted to the life of a military wife, a role she had little prior experience with, but one she embraced with grace. She became an integral part of Louis's world, offering him not only companionship but also a sharp mind that helped him navigate the complex politics of his military career. The couple moved frequently, following Louis's assignments, first to Morocco, then to Tunisia, and later to the front lines of the First World War. As Louis ascended the ranks of the French military, Marie was there, a steady and intelligent presence by his side, providing counsel when needed and offering emotional support in times of stress. Through these years, Marie faced many challenges. Being a military wife meant long periods of separation, constant upheaval, and the uncertainty of war. But despite these hardships, she remained steadfast. It was during this time that she learned not only to be the supportive wife of a military leader, but to embody the role of a strategic partner in her own right. She began to take a more active interest in the broader political and military landscape, understanding that the decisions made on distant battlefields would have repercussions for France and for Europe as a whole. Louis's career was advancing rapidly. By 1914, he was promoted to the rank of general. It was a position that would place him in the heart of the action during the Great War. And Marie would find herself caught up in the maelstrom of one of the deadliest conflicts the world had ever known. In the early months of the war, as the German forces advanced through Belgium and into France, Marie's life would change irrevocably. Louis was called to command the French forces in the Balkans, where he would later achieve a decisive victory that would seal his reputation as one of France's greatest military minds. During this time, Marie found herself at the epicenter of the political and military changes sweeping across Europe. She had already lived through several wars, but this was different. The stakes were higher than ever before. While Louis led his forces from the front lines, Marie worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She was not just a wife or a mere observer of history. She was a participant in it, whether through her correspondence with political leaders or her involvement in efforts to support the war effort. Marie played a key role in shaping the outcome of battles far beyond the front lines. Her influence would grow over the next few years, as she became a symbol of strength and resilience, not just to her husband but to the French people as a whole. In the face of unimaginable loss and hardship, Marie d'Espéry remained a beacon of courage, a woman whose life had been marked by history and whose legacy would be etched into the annals of France's military and political future. As the war raged on, Marie was confronted with the harsh realities of what it meant to stand beside a man whose very decisions could change the course of nations. She had no illusions about the sacrifices required of her and her husband, but even as she endured the separations, the fear, and the uncertainties of war, she remained a steadfast partner to Louis and a key figure in the larger story of France's survival. The years that followed would test both of them in ways they never could have imagined. But through it all, their bond would grow stronger, a partnership forged not just in love, but in shared ambition, hardship, and a relentless desire to shape the world for the better. The winter of 1877 marked the beginning of a journey that neither Marie nor Louis could have foreseen. Their wedding had been a grand affair, yet beneath the surface of the celebration lay the weight of the unknown. For Marie, the choice to marry Louis had not been just an act of love, but a commitment to the ideals that he represented: duty, honor, and the pursuit of something greater than themselves. But as their lives began to unfold in the shadow of war, it became clear that their bond would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Louis Franchet d'Espéry, though deeply in love with his bride, had long understood the nature of military life. As an officer in the French army, his career was not one he could set aside. Even for the woman he adored, it was a delicate balance between his love for Marie and his loyalty to France. From the moment they exchanged vows, Louis was already a soldier on the front lines of Europe's brewing tensions. War was inevitable. The question was no longer if, but when. Marie, although born to a life of relative comfort, had been raised in an environment steeped in the stories of wars past. Her father, a minor noble, had always emphasized the importance of discipline and honor, the values of their lineage. Yet, nothing had prepared her for the reality of a marriage defined not by shared daily life, but by the constant distance of war. First, their letters were frequent, and in them, Marie poured out her heart to Louis. Her words were both comforting and calculated, offering him strength even as she struggled with her own feelings of isolation. The letters reflected her intelligence and depth of character. She wrote of the mundane details of life in Paris, the social events she attended, the friends she made, and the progress of their estates. But there was always an underlying tone of understanding that this was not the life they had dreamed of together. Louis, for his part, was a man of action. His letters to Marie were filled with military updates and thoughts on strategy. But they also contained moments of tenderness, offering glimpses into the heart of a man who, despite his tough exterior, was deeply affected by his separation from his wife. His letters became increasingly infrequent, as his duties called him away to distant lands. Each time they parted, it was as if he left behind a piece of himself, something Marie keenly felt with every passing day. In the years that followed, Louis's military career flourished. His tactical brilliance began to be recognized, first by his peers and then by his superiors. But as Louis rose through the ranks, the wars he fought in became more brutal and the stakes higher. In 1879, he was sent to Algeria to fight in the colonial campaigns, a brutal and grueling series of engagements that would change the course of his career. It was there, amidst the harsh landscapes of North Africa, that Louis truly proved his mettle, earning both admiration and animosity in equal measure. While Louis was away, Marie struggled with the weight of her own responsibilities. As the wife of a high-ranking officer, she was expected to uphold the dignity of her family and support her husband's career. But the loneliness she experienced was something no amount of duty or societal expectation could alleviate. Paris, though a city of endless social opportunities, felt increasingly hollow. The glittering salons that had once seemed so full of promise now seemed like mere distractions from the deep emptiness she felt in Louis's absence. Yet it was in these dark moments that Marie found herself growing stronger. She became involved in several philanthropic causes, especially those related to the families of soldiers fighting in the colonies. Through her charity work, she met several women who, like her, had husbands or brothers fighting in distant lands. These women were united not only by their shared grief, but by a deep understanding of what it meant to love a man who was both their husband and a soldier. A man who belonged not only to them, but to a larger, often impersonal world of conflict and duty. One of these women, a widow named Madeleine, became one of Marie's closest confidants. Madeleine's husband had been killed in a skirmish during the Algerian campaigns, and her grief was raw, her sorrow never truly dissipating. Yet, through her, Marie found a new understanding of the sacrifices of war. She learned to channel her emotions into something productive, something that would honor Louis's work and all the soldiers who had been sent to die for their country. By 1881, Louis had returned to Paris on leave, and though their reunion was filled with warmth and love, there was a subtle change in both of them. Louis had seen horrors in Algeria, and it was clear that the war had left an indelible mark on him. He no longer spoke of grand ambitions or future conquests. Instead, he spoke of the men he had lost, the men who had died under his command, and the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. Marie listened, her heart aching for him, but also filled with a quiet sense of pride. She knew that his strength, the strength that had drawn her to him in the first place, was not simply in his victories on the battlefield, but in his ability to endure, to continue forward despite the cost. Their marriage, once a union filled with youthful optimism and dreams of an idyllic future, had become something far more complex. It was now a partnership forged in the fires of war. They had learned to love each other not in spite of the challenges they faced, but because of them. But peace, as it always does, was fleeting. The world was moving toward another great conflict. By 1887, Europe was teetering on the brink of war once again. Tensions between France, Germany, and the various alliances began to escalate. Louis, now a seasoned officer, was once again called to the front lines, this time to the Balkans, where a different kind of battle awaited, one that would define not only his career but the course of history itself. As he left for the Balkans, Marie stood on the platform at the train station, watching him disappear into the distance. The weight of the moment was not lost on either of them. They had said their goodbyes many times before, but this time felt different. It was as if the war itself had become a shadow that loomed over them, something that neither of them could escape. And yet, as always, they found solace in their letters, each one a small bridge between them, each one a reminder that their love could endure even in the face of the greatest trials. By the time Louis Franchet d'Espery had ascended the ranks of the French military, Europe was on the edge of a precipice. The simmering tensions between the great powers had begun to boil over, and the world was about to be engulfed in the flames of a war that would reshape the entire continent. The year was 1914, and the peaceful days that Marie and Louis had once known were quickly becoming a distant memory. Though Louis had already made a name for himself as a capable and shrewd officer, he had little idea that the coming conflict would thrust him into the spotlight of military history. He had spent years in North Africa, in the trenches of Algeria, and in the heart of France, learning the art of warfare and the intricacies of strategy. But it was his assignment to lead the French forces in the Balkans that would catapult him into the limelight. The winds of war began to stir when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, setting off a chain reaction that drew in the alliances of Russia, Germany, France, and Britain. Louis was summoned to the front lines, tasked with leading the French contingent in the Mediterranean and Balkans. Marie, by this time a seasoned partner in her husband's military career, knew what this meant. Her beloved Louis would once again be separated from her, thrust into the brutal grind of battle. Marie had never been one to shy away from the challenges of her role as a military wife. But the war was different. The letters they exchanged during his time at the front were filled with the quiet strength that marked their relationship. Yet there was an unmistakable tension between the lines. Louis spoke of strategy, of victory and defeat, and of the men who fought beside him. But Marie, in her letters, spoke of the world she was left behind, the children they had yet to have, the future they dreamed of, and the quiet moments they once shared. It was not just the physical distance between them that caused strain, but the emotional toll of the war itself. Louis, who had once been a man of great conviction and strength, now found himself confronted with the horrors of modern warfare. The trenches, the mud, and the constant threat of death weighed heavily on him. He became consumed with thoughts of strategy and victory, but also with the responsibility he felt for the lives of those under his command. His leadership would soon be tested on a scale that would push him to his limits. For Marie, the war represented a different kind of challenge. As the wife of a prominent military leader, she became involved in the war effort in ways she had not expected. The French government, recognizing her intelligence and social standing, began to rely on her for diplomatic efforts. She would host meetings with military officials, write letters to other military spouses, and even coordinate fundraising efforts for the war. While she was not on the battlefield, her role was no less vital. She was the silent force that held together the home front, the woman whose calm and determination helped rally the country in its darkest hours. Amidst all this, Marie and Louis's letters continued to be their most treasured form of connection. They exchanged stories of their daily lives, hers of children, of social events, of letters from the front, while his spoke of strategies, enemy movements, and the toll war was taking on him. Their letters were filled with love, but also with a kind of unspoken fear. Both knew that this war was different, that it was a war from which many men would not return. Louis's role in the war quickly escalated. In 1915, the French government appointed him to command the French Army of the Orient, a pivotal role that placed him in charge of the campaign in the Balkans and the Middle East. It was here, in the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia, that he would face his most difficult challenges yet. But it was also here that his leadership would shine, as he led French and British forces to a crucial victory against the Ottoman Empire. His strategic brilliance, combined with his deep understanding of the geography and political realities of the region, would make him a hero not just in France, but in the broader Allied world. Yet, as Louis triumphed on the battlefield, Marie faced her own battles at home. The toll of the war on the French people was immense, and she, along with many other women, took on roles traditionally held by men. She became a symbol of resilience, a woman who could balance the demands of family and society while supporting the war effort. Her letters to Louis were filled with hope, but they also revealed the deep loneliness she felt in his absence. She missed him terribly, but more than that, she feared for him. The war was unpredictable, and every telegram or letter she received from him was a reminder of the danger he faced. As the war raged on, the distance between them grew not just physically, but emotionally. Louis's experiences on the front lines were beginning to change him. The once idealistic officer, driven by honor and the desire for glory, was now a man hardened by the realities of war. His letters, once filled with optimism, began to reflect the toll the war was taking on him. He was exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually. He had witnessed the slaughter of thousands, the loss of men he had known for years, and the destruction of entire villages. War, he realized, was not the noble cause he had once believed it to be. Marie, too, was changing. The woman who had once lived in the quiet, idyllic countryside now found herself at the center of a global conflict. Her life marked by the rhythm of the war. She was no longer just Louis's wife. She was a symbol of the strength of the French people, the enduring spirit of those who remained behind. And yet, the love they shared, once so pure and idealistic, was beginning to show the wear and tear of time and circumstance. She had no choice but to accept that her husband, the man she had married, was now a different person. The war had left its mark on him, and on their relationship. Through it all, Marie held fast to her belief in Louis. She believed in the man he had been and the man he could still become. And despite the distance and the hardship, she remained his unwavering support. As the war dragged on, she knew that the ultimate test of their love and of their strength was yet to come. As the war raged on, Marie found herself ensnared in a cycle of uncertainty, waiting for letters from Louis that could be delayed for weeks or, times, even months. The days felt endless, and with each passing moment, The news of casualties and battles lost or won would reach her, amplifying her fears for the man she loved. The war was consuming Europe, and no one was immune to its reach, not even those far from the front lines. Marie had grown accustomed to the silence that would often stretch between letters. In those moments, she found solace in the routines that kept her grounded. She visited the hospital wards, organizing charity drives for the wounded soldiers, and helped rally support for the families who had lost their loved ones. Yet, despite her outward poise and dedication to the war effort, there was an aching void that no amount of social work could fill. Louis's absence was a constant shadow in her life, a reminder of the war's far-reaching consequences. In the midst of these difficult times, Marie found herself drawn to other women who shared her grief. They were wives, sisters, and mothers of soldiers who, like her, had been left behind. They formed a tight-knit community, their shared sorrow binding them together. These women had a resilience that was forged in the fires of wartime. Together, they found comfort in their collective strength. But there was always the underlying fear that one day they, too, would receive the dreaded news of a fallen soldier. As for Louis, the war had turned him into a man of legend. His leadership during the Battle of the Balkans had proven decisive in the final months of the war, and his role in the subsequent peace negotiations would shape the future of Europe. But it had come at a tremendous cost. Though Louis's name was now synonymous with victory, his soul had been marked by the horrors he had witnessed. He had seen men, friends, and comrades fall before him, and no amount of glory could erase the haunting images of battle. His leadership, once the foundation of his strength, now seemed like a fragile thread in a world unraveling before his eyes. In late 1918, after the armistice was signed, Louis finally returned to Paris. His arrival was met with fanfare, parades, speeches, and the adoration of a grateful nation. But for Marie, there was a different kind of reunion. She had spent years without him, living with the constant anxiety of not knowing whether he was alive or dead. When she saw him step off the train, worn and weary, his uniform still bearing the marks of the battlefields, she realized how much the war had taken from them both. Louis embraced her with the same fervor he always had, but there was a distance in his eyes, a weariness that no amount of love could cure. It was the unspoken truth between them. The war had changed him in ways that words could not convey. He was no longer the man who had left Paris years ago, full of ambition and youthful optimism. The war had stripped him of those illusions, leaving behind a man who had seen too much, felt too much, and, perhaps, lost too much. Marie, however, was not one to dwell on the past. She had waited for him, yes, but she had also carried on without him. Her life had not stopped in his absence, and now, as they stood together once again, she realized that the road ahead would not be as simple as picking up where they had left off. The war had reshaped them both, and though they still loved each other deeply, their bond would need to be reforged in the quiet aftermath of conflict. They spent the next few months in a kind of limbo, adjusting to their new lives. Louis took on advisory roles in the military, helping rebuild France's fractured alliances and assisting with the reintegration of soldiers back into civilian life. But for Marie, the quiet that followed the chaos of war was almost as difficult as the war itself. The bustling streets of Paris, once filled with the sound of soldiers marching and the tension of impending battle, now felt eerily silent. The rebuilding of Europe was underway, but the emotional toll on the individuals who had lived through the war was far from over. Louis and Marie navigated this new world with the same quiet resolve that had defined their relationship from the start. They had survived the war, but the real challenge lay in the years that followed, in learning to live in a world that had been irrevocably changed, not just by the destruction of war, but by the personal toll it had taken on them both. The victories of the battlefield had their price, and as Marie and Louis found out, the hardest battles often came after the guns fell silent. By the summer of 1918, the war had reached its zenith. The trenches of the Western Front had become an emblem of the horrors of modern warfare, a brutal and unrelenting conflict where men fought not just for their survival, but for the ideals of their nations. The world had already witnessed the devastating toll of the war, the staggering loss of life, the suffering of civilians, and the psychological scars borne by the soldiers. But the war was not over yet, and neither Louis nor Marie could have known the toll it would take on them before it finally came to an end. For Louis Franchet d'Espéry, 1918 marked a defining year in his military career. He had become a general, tasked with leading one of the largest and most complex campaigns of the war, the final push to break the German lines and end the conflict. The 100 Days Offensive, which began in August 1918, was the culmination of years of sacrifice and strategy. Louis's leadership was crucial in securing victory in this decisive moment. He led his troops with a combination of daring and discipline, pushing back the German forces with determination and skill. His success in the Balkans had earned him the trust of his superiors, and now he was tasked with a role that would cement his place in history. But as the French forces made their final assault, the cost of victory became painfully clear. The long months of battle had worn Louis down, physically and mentally. He had seen countless friends and soldiers fall, their lives extinguished in a seemingly endless cycle of violence. Despite the victories, there was no sense of triumph, only a somber recognition of the immense price that had been paid. Back in Paris, Marie had followed the news of the offensive with a mix of hope and dread. She had received letters from Louis in which he spoke of strategy, of final victories, and of the sacrifices that were being made. But she knew, in the pit of her stomach, that there was a heavy cost to these successes, one that would take more than just soldiers to pay. The emotional and physical toll on Louis was becoming clearer with each letter, and the fear that had haunted her throughout the war began to shift into something more concrete, a realization that, even if Louis survived, he would not return to her the same man who had left. In one letter, written just before the final push into Germany, Louis spoke of his exhaustion. He described the battlefield, not with the customary detachment of a soldier, but with a rawness that Marie had not seen before. He spoke of the faces of the men, the camaraderie, and the unspoken bond that tied them together in the face of death. "I have seen things," he wrote, "that no man should ever have to see. I wonder sometimes if this war will end, or if it will continue to live inside us long after it is over." Marie's heart sank as she read those words. She could almost hear his voice, tired and weary, through the lines of his letter. In many ways, the war had already claimed a part of Louis, even before the final battles were fought. When the war ended in November 1918, with the signing of the armistice, there was no celebration for Marie. There were no grand parades or jubilant reunions. Instead, there was an overwhelming sense of relief, mixed with sorrow, for the world had been irrevocably changed. Louis returned to Paris, but he was a different man. The weight of the war had taken its toll on his health, his mind, and his soul. The man who had left her in 1914, full of purpose and ambition, had come back worn and broken, struggling to reconcile the man he had been with the man he had become. For Marie, the end of the war was not a return to the life they had once known. There was no going back. She welcomed him home, but the man who returned to her arms was no longer the same. He was distant, his eyes haunted by the things he had witnessed on the battlefield. The joy that had once defined their relationship seemed to have been consumed by the darkness of war. Louis's recovery, both physical and emotional, was slow. He withdrew from the public eye, refusing many of the honors and accolades that were offered to him for his service. Marie, ever devoted, became his anchor. She knew that the man she had married was still within him, but it would take time for him to find himself again. The world had changed, but their bond remained a constant. However, it was a bond marked by the deep scars of war, scars that neither time nor love could easily erase. Together, they faced the aftermath of the war, not just the physical injuries, but the emotional wreckage. The man who had been so strong and certain now struggled with depression and memories of loss. And yet, through it all, Marie remained by his side. The war had taken so much from both of them, but it had also brought them closer. They had survived the storm together, and they would face the uncertain future as one, scarred, yes, but resilient. As Louis slowly began to heal, both inside and out, Marie found herself questioning the very nature of duty and sacrifice. She had always admired Louis's dedication to his country, his comrades, and to her. But now, as the world moved forward into a new era, she wondered if the price of that duty had been too high. The world they had once known was gone, replaced by a new, uncertain order. And in this new world, both she and Louis would need to rebuild not just their lives, but their sense of purpose. For Marie, the war had altered the very fabric of who they were. But even in the aftermath of the most horrific conflict the world had ever seen, she clung to the belief that love and resilience could overcome anything. And together, she and Louis would find their way, not as they once were, but as they needed to be in the world that had emerged from the ashes of war. When the war finally ended in November 1918, it brought with it both relief and a deep, enduring sorrow. The armistice was signed, and the guns fell silent, but for Marie and Louis, it was a victory overshadowed by the personal costs of the conflict. The streets of Paris erupted in celebration, as the city and the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. But Louis, now a decorated hero, returned home as a man irrevocably changed. The man who had left for war was not the same man who returned. Louis had fought on the front lines of the 100 Days Offensive, the final push to break the German resistance. His leadership had been instrumental in the success of the campaign, but the cost had been staggering. His health, both physical and mental, had been shattered by the months of relentless combat, the weight of command, and the personal toll of losing so many comrades. Yet, when he came back to Marie, he was still the same man, steadfast, resolute, but now marked by the invisible scars of war. Marie, for her part, had never stopped hoping for his return. The long years of separation, the sleepless nights filled with fear and anxiety, had taken their toll on her as well. But when she saw Louis again, standing at the door of their Parisian estate, looking thinner and wearier than she had ever seen him, a rush of emotions swept over her. The love they shared was still there, but it was now intertwined with the complex realities of war. A love that had endured, but had also been shaped and tested by the hardships they had faced. The couple spent the early days of peace in quiet reflection. Louis struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by the memories of the battlefield. Marie, ever the pillar of strength, did her best to help him through the darkness. But there were moments when words seemed inadequate. She, too, had been changed by the war. Her once optimistic spirit had been tempered by the loss of so many, by the grief of watching entire families torn apart. The war had taken from them both, but it had also given them something deeper, a profound understanding of the fragility of life, and the importance of cherishing the moments they had together. It wasn't long before Louis took on new responsibilities, both in military affairs and in the rebuilding of post-war France. The country, now faced with the immense task of healing after the horrors of war, needed men like him, men who had seen the full brunt of conflict and could help lead the way toward recovery. Marie supported him fully, but their relationship, once defined by their youthful dreams and ambitions, had become one of quiet understanding. They no longer spoke of the future in grand terms, but of small, cherished moments, long walks through the parks of Paris, quiet dinners by the fire, and the simple joy of knowing that they had survived together. As the years passed, Marie and Louis slowly began to find a semblance of peace. Louis continued to serve in various military capacities, offering his expertise to the rebuilding efforts in the Balkans and North Africa. He was often away, but his letters were frequent, filled with the same warmth and love that had first drawn them together. Marie, 2. Found her purpose in the aftermath of the war. She worked tirelessly for various charitable organizations, helping those who had been left behind, the widows, the orphans, the wounded veterans who were struggling to make sense of their lives after the war. In doing so, she found healing, not just for herself, but for the larger community that had been shattered by the conflict. In the twilight years of their lives, as they sat together on their estate overlooking the French countryside, Louis and Marie would often reflect on the path they had taken. They spoke little of the war in their later years, for the wounds were too deep to revisit. Instead, they focused on the legacy they had built, not just as individuals, but as a family, as part of a greater nation that had endured and emerged stronger from the crucible of war. Marie lived to see the 1930s, a decade of great change, but she was content in the knowledge that she and Louis had weathered the worst storms life had to offer. When Louis passed away in 1935, the country mourned the loss of a military hero and a leader who had played a pivotal role in the Great War. For Marie, the loss of her beloved husband was the closing of a chapter that had spanned a lifetime, one filled with love, sacrifice, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. In the years that followed, Marie would often be seen walking alone through the streets of Paris, her mind drifting back to those early days when the world seemed so full of promise. She had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in history, and while she had lost much, she had also gained an invaluable understanding of what it meant to love, to sacrifice, and to endure. When Marie passed away in the early 1940s, France honored her not only as the wife of a great general, but as a woman who had stood alongside him through the greatest trials of their time. Her legacy was one of quiet strength, of love that transcended the ravages of war, and of a life lived with dignity in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the end, the story of Louis and Marie Franchet d'Espéry was not just the tale of two individuals caught in the sweeping currents of history, but a testament to the power of love and resilience, qualities that endure. Even when the world around them changes forever, their love story was not one of fairy tale romance, but of real life, forged in the fires of war and strengthened by the quiet moments of peace that followed.